The night was heavy with rain, and within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, a candle struggled against the darkness. The flame quivered with every draught that slipped through the cracks, throwing restless shadows across the chamber where a king once known for his crown now sat forgotten. The man was Edward of Caernarfon, Edward the Sancred of England, son of Edward Longshanks, heir to one of the most formidable legacies in medieval Europe. His face, once surrounded by courtiers and marked by the dignity of rule, now reflected only the silence of captivity. The sounds around him were not the voices of loyal knights or the clamor of court, but the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the mournful groan of the wind pressing against barred windows. Here was the image of a monarch, undone, abandoned, and waiting for a fate he could not escape. The candle before him burned like a fragile symbol of his life, trembling and uncertain, its light flickering as if it too feared extinction. The question rises immediately for anyone who contemplates his fall. How had it come to this? How could the son of a great warrior king, who inherited dominion and command, end his reign in such humiliation, betrayed by his own queen and forsaken by his realm? To answer this, one must turn back to the shadow that loomed over him from the very beginning, the figure of his father, Edward III, so remembered by history as Longshanks. Edward there was a king of a different age and a different nature. Tall, imposing, and relentless, he carved his name into the chronicles of England with a sword as much as with a pen. He brought Wales under English control through campaigns of fire and iron, building castles that still crowned the Welsh hills as monuments to conquest. He turned his gaze upon Scotland, seeking to bind it under his crown, and he never relented in that ambition, even in the final days of his life. His reign was marked not only by war, but by law. He strengthened the authority of the crown, reshaped the statutes of the realm, and bound together the machinery of government with stern efficiency. To his subjects, he seemed the very image of kingship, commanding, unyielding, and clear in purpose. This was the standard set for his son. When Longshanks looked upon Edward of Caernarfon, he expected to find a reflection of his own martial strength and iron will. What he found instead was a boy drawn not to the clang of steel or the clash of armies, but to the gentler rhythms of life. Born in 1284 in Caernarfon Castle, the very fortress designed to embody English rule over Wales, Edward entered the world as a symbol of power. Yet his nature leaned toward music and song, toward swimming in rivers and rowing boats, toward rustic pastimes and laughter with companions. He enjoyed the company of those who entertained him, and he sought loyalty of the heart more than obedience born of fear. To a father who measured manhood in conquests and crowns, these qualities seemed dangerously out of place. The young prince was thus set apart from the very beginning. Where his father built authority through awe, he built intimacy through affection. Where Longshanks demanded rigid loyalty, Edward gave his devotion freely to friends. In the structured hierarchy of the Plantagenet court, where barons guarded their rights and rank with fierce pride, such behavior soon became a source of suspicion. It was not unusual for princes to have favorites, companions who shared their youth. But in Edward's case, the intensity of his attachments and the favors he lavished upon them drew the ire of the nobility. They feared that personal affection might outweigh political necessity, and their fear would soon prove well-founded. When Edward the Rich died in 1307, the transition was sudden. The great warrior who had demanded that his bones be carried into Scotland to continue the war left his son with more than a crown. He left him with unfinished battles, strained finances, and the expectation of iron-fisted leadership. But the new king did not step into his father's mold. Instead of pressing forward in Scotland, Edward II disbanded much of the army. Instead of honoring his father's alliances and respecting the balance of power, he turned his attention to a companion who had long been the center of his affections, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was witty, charming, and close to the king in a way that made the nobility deeply uncomfortable. Edward raised him to titles and lands far above his station, even granting him the prestigious role of Earl of Cornwall. To the barons, this was not only favoritism, but an insult, for Cornwall had traditionally been a dignity reserved for princes of the royal blood. Thus, from the first moments of his reign, Edward II revealed the qualities that would define and undo him. His loyalty to those he loved was steadfast, but it blinded him to political reality. His desire for closeness was genuine, but it alienated those who expected a king to stand above all, not beside chosen favorites. The nobility who had trembled before Edward I now sensed weakness and found reason to resist. Where Longshanks had dominated them, his son seemed to invite their interference. The contrast between father and son could not have been more stark. Chronicles of the age, always eager for moral lessons, painted the father as a towering oak and the son as a fragile reed. Edward the Foreign had ridden into battle in gleaming armor, his presence alone enough to steady his men. Edward II's preferred gardens and rivers, music and camaraderie. His strength found more in play than in war. To the culture of medieval England, which valued martial valor above almost every other quality, this was a grievous flaw. Kingship was not measured by kindness or by devotion to companions, but by the ability to lead armies, secure borders, and command respect through fear if necessary. Yet to dismiss Edward II as weak alone is to miss the complexity of his character. He was no coward. He was strong of body, known for athletic feats, and capable of endurance. He could show flashes of resolve, even stubbornness, but his understanding of kingship was colored by a personality out of step with his times. He placed trust in personal bonds over the careful balancing of political factions. He valued private happiness more than public prestige. And in an age where the crown stood as the pinnacle of martial and political responsibility, such qualities placed him in constant conflict with the nobility. The story of his reign would be shaped by this contradiction. The very traits that might have made him a beloved friend, a loyal companion, even a good private man, became the seeds of disaster when worn with the crown of England. His devotion to Gaveston set him against the barons. His indifference to the unfinished wars of his father weakened his position abroad. His elevation of other favorites later in his reign deepened the divide between king and realm. What had begun as personality soon became politics, and politics in medieval England was unforgiving. And so we return to the image with which this tale began, the lonely figure in the Tower of London, candlelight quivering as though it shared his fate. That solitude did not arise overnight. It was born from the very first choices of his reign, from the gentle inclinations of a man who did not fit the mold of his father, from the alienation of a nobility that demanded strength above all. Edward II's tragedy was not only that he was deposed and abandoned, but that the very qualities that made him human became the reasons he was condemned as a king. His fall, then, is not simply the story of a man unsuited to rule. It is also the story of a realm unwilling to accept a different vision of kingship, a realm still haunted by the shadow of Longshanks, still demanding a monarch who could wield the sword with authority and command obedience without hesitation. Edward II could not, or would not, be that man. His reign would unfold in the tension between his nature and his office, between his private desires and the public role he could not escape. That tension would lead to conflict with his barons, humiliation on the battlefield, and ultimately betrayal within his own household. But in these early years, as the candle trembled in the darkness of the tower, all of that still lay ahead, waiting to be told. The summer of 1307 carried with it a sense of exhaustion. For decades, England had been locked in the struggle to subdue Scotland, a war born of Edward I's ambition to expand his authority northward. The aging monarch, by then well into his late 60s, still carried with him the iron will that had defined his life. Even as illness weakened his body, he insisted on continuing the campaign, determined that Scotland would bend before the English crown. Chroniclers later wrote of the old king traveling with his army, too frail at times to mount his horse, yet unwilling to surrender the fight. To his men, he remained a figure of relentless authority, the warrior king whose very name struck fear across borders. It was on this campaign that fate intervened. In July of that year, Edward I breathed his last, not in a grand hall or a royal chamber, but in the field, near Berg by sands, gazing northward toward the land he had long sought to conquer. His death marked not only the end of a reign that had stretched over 3 decades, but also the passing of an age of stern leadership. In his final instructions, he had commanded that the war against the Scots be pursued without mercy, that his bones, if need be, should be carried at the head of the army to inspire victory. Such was the iron spirit of Longshanks, demanding that even death not release him from the duties of conquest. The crown now passed to his son, Edward II, who at 23 ascended the throne under the gaze of both allies and enemies. For the barons and soldiers who had marched under Longshanks, the expectation was clear. The son must continue the father's struggle. They looked for resolve, for the echo of iron in the voice of their new king, for the continuation of a war that had defined a generation. But Edward II was not his father. His first decisions as king revealed a startling contrast. Where Edward III had ordered steel and fire, Edward II ordered dismissal. He called an end to the Scottish campaign, sending soldiers back to their homes, disbanding forces that had been gathered with such cost and effort. What had been envisioned as a march of vengeance and conquest dissolved into retreat and dispersal. To the veterans of Longshanks' wars, it was a gesture that felt like betrayal. To those who revered the memory of the dead king, it was nothing less than the breaking of his last command. This single act, made in the first days of his reign, would cast a long shadow. It signaled not only the change of a monarch, but the change of an age. No longer would the kingdom be led by the unyielding hand of a warrior king. Instead, it was placed in the care of a man whose instincts leaned away from war and toward other pursuits. A man who valued peace for himself, even at the cost of prestige for his crown. To the barons, it raised questions of strength. To the common soldier, it whispered of weakness. And to Scotland, it offered hope that the relentless pressure of England might at last falter. The chroniclers of the time recorded the transition with a tone of disbelief. They had expected the son to honor the legacy of his father, to ride into Scotland as the embodiment of continuity. Instead, they witnessed the dispersal of armies and the dimming of ambition. The image of Edward the Warrior, stern even in death, stood in haunting contrast to the image of his son, young and untested, already retreating from the path laid before him. Yet within this choice lay the essence of Edward II's reign. His priorities were not those of conquest or of the iron will of his father. He sought comfort, loyalty of companions, and the easing of burdens. Where Longshanks would have demanded sacrifice for the sake of glory, his son sought release from the weight of endless campaigning. In doing so, he set the tone for years to come, years marked not by the victories of war, but by the conflicts within his own kingdom, conflicts born of suspicion, disappointment, and the widening gap between what the nobility expected of a king and what Edward II was willing or able to provide. And so, from the very hour of succession, the seeds of his downfall were planted. The son of Longshanks had taken the crown, but he had also broken with the spirit of his inheritance. The rain that fell on Burgh by Sands when the old king died seemed almost a prelude, a mourning for the stern monarch gone, and an omen for the reign of the son, who would prove so different. Edward II's story was now truly underway, and it would be shaped by this first and fateful decision. Piers Gaveston entered Edward's life long before the crown passed to him, but it was in the first years of his reign that their bond became the defining feature of the English court. Born in Gascony, the son of a knight who had served Edward I, Gaveston was not of great lineage, yet what he lacked in noble pedigree he made up for in charm, wit, and a magnetic confidence that seemed to draw the young Edward toward him. Chroniclers described Gaveston as handsome, quick of tongue, skilled in arms, and possessed of a boldness that allowed him to walk into any hall as though he belonged there. To Edward, weary of the rigid expectations of his father and the cold formality of court, Gaveston must have seemed like a beacon of warmth and delight. Their companionship was immediate and intense. Edward found in Gaveston a confidant, a partner in games, in conversation, and perhaps in matters of the heart. Where others demanded obedience or measured him against the iron standard of his father, Gaveston offered acceptance and joy. Their closeness grew to such a degree that even before he became king, Edward's devotion to Gaveston had raised eyebrows. Edward I, stern and suspicious, had once banished Gaveston from his son's company, fearing the influence he exerted. Yet with the death of Longshanks, nothing now stood between Edward II and the man he cherished most. In one of his earliest acts as king, Edward recalled Gaveston and showered him with honors that startled the nobility. He made him Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in the realm, long reserved for princes of the royal blood. He granted him lands and revenues that placed him among the wealthiest lords of England. At court, Gaveston was elevated not merely as a companion, but as a figure of power, consulted on decisions, included in ceremonies, and allowed to share in the symbols of sovereignty. To Edward, it was the natural expression of gratitude and affection toward his most loyal friend. To the barons, it was an outrage. The English aristocracy, proud of their ancestry and jealous of their privileges, saw in Gaveston not only an upstart foreigner, but also a rival who threatened the balance of power. His Gascon origins marked him as an outsider. His sudden rise seemed to mock the traditions that bound the nobility together. More than that, his manner, witty, sometimes mocking, often flamboyant, earned him enemies quickly. Chroniclers record that he gave mocking nicknames to great lords, ridiculed their manners, and flaunted the favor he enjoyed with the king. What to Edward may have seemed harmless amusement, to the barons was provocation. This tension grew sharper because the barons recognized in Gaveston something far more dangerous than wit or charm. They saw that he held the king's heart. In him, Edward found the companionship that had always eluded him among the proud magnates of his realm. Decisions once expected to flow through the Council of Lords now passed through whispered conversations between the king and his friend. Policies, appointments, and rewards all bore the mark of Gaveston's influence. It was as though the crown itself had shifted from the ancient families of England to the hands of one Gascon knight. For Edward, this loyalty was a virtue. He had grown up in the shadow of a father who had measured him against impossible standards and among barons who judged him unfit for the role he inherited. In Gaveston, he found someone who did not measure him, who did not demand conquest or comparison, but who simply shared his joys and sorrows. In elevating his friend, Edward may have believed he was rewarding true devotion in a world filled with suspicion, but in the process, he set himself on a collision course with the great men of his kingdom who would never forgive such favoritism. Thus, the figure of Piers Gaveston became the lightning rod of the early reign. To Edward, he was indispensable, a companion whose presence brought him strength. To the nobility, he was a symbol of corruption, arrogance, and the dangerous weakness of the crown. In those first years after 1307, the stage was already set for conflict. The loyalty of a king to his friend would soon be tested against the fury of his barons, and the story of Edward II's downfall had found its first and most brilliant actor. By 1311, the tension that had simmered in the English court could no longer be contained. The favor Edward lavished upon Piers Gaveston, coupled with the resentment of the great lords, created a climate of distrust that threatened to destabilize the entire realm. The barons, many of them veterans of Longshanks wars and heirs to ancient traditions of power, looked upon Edward as a monarch who squandered the legacy of his father. To them, the crown was not a private possession to be shared with a single favorite, but an institution bound to the will of the realm. Their frustration gathered momentum in Parliament, where the most powerful magnates formed. A council determined to limit the king's authority. From their perspective, Edward had abandoned the duties of kingship. He had neglected the wars abroad, he had weakened the prestige of the crown, and worst of all, he had placed the governance of England into the hands of Gaveston. To restore balance, they drafted a set of ordinances, a collection of reforms that sought to bind the monarchy itself within chains of baronial oversight. The ordinances of 1311, as they came to be known, were not a gentle suggestion but a declaration of intent. They demanded strict regulation of the king's household and finances, restricted his ability to appoint ministers without consent, and required that the governance of the realm be guided by the collective authority of the nobility. At the heart of these ordinances lay a single, unavoidable demand: the exile of Piers Gaveston. To the barons, his presence at court was not merely an annoyance, but an affront to the very order of the kingdom. Removing him was, in their eyes, the first and necessary step toward restoring stability. Edward resisted with all the resolve of his nature. Gaveston was more than a companion. He was the one figure who provided the king with trust and affection in a world of hostility. To send him away was to strip Edward of his anchor, to force him once again into the cold circle of nobles who judged him unworthy. Yet the pressure was relentless. The barons spoke not only with words, but with armed force behind them, and Edward, however unwilling, was compelled to agree. Gaveston was banished, forced to depart from the realm under the watchful eyes of men who rejoiced in his downfall. But exile did not mean separation. Each time Gaveston was driven out, Edward found a way to bring him back. Sometimes it was through political maneuvering, sometimes through open defiance. Letters were exchanged, envoys dispatched, and schemes contrived to restore him to the king's side. To Edward, loyalty outweighed legality, and friendship outweighed the ordinances of Parliament. Each return of Gaveston ignited the fury of the nobility afresh, convincing them that the king would never honor their reforms and never release his hold upon the man they despised. The cycle repeated itself. Banishment followed by recall, anger followed by reconciliation, the king clinging to his friend while the lords plotted against him. It was a drama that played out not only in the halls of Westminster, but across the realm, where men whispered that the king placed personal devotion above the law of the land. The ordinances intended to assert the authority of the nobility instead revealed the deep fracture between monarch and magnates, a fracture that would widen with every act of defiance. In these years, Edward's reign began to take on the shape of tragedy. His devotion to Gaveston, admirable in its loyalty, became destructive in its consequences. Each recall was an assertion of love, but also a spark that threatened to ignite civil discord. The ordinances themselves, meant to strengthen the kingdom, instead exposed the fragility of its governance. A king who could not yield his heart, and nobles who would not yield their pride, together steered England toward confrontation. By the close of 1311, it was clear that the ordinances had not resolved the crisis, but deepened it. Edward remained king, but a king whose power was curtailed. Gaveston remained his companion, but a companion marked for ruin. The barons remained the guardians of tradition, but now armed with the conviction that only force would settle the question of who truly ruled England. The stage was set for the conflict to escalate, and the loyalty of Edward II would soon be tested against the wrath of his realm. In the spring of 1312, the storm that had been gathering around Piers Gaveston finally broke. His repeated returns to England, each one defying the ordinances of 1311 and the authority of the barons, had enraged the nobility beyond endurance. The great magnates of the realm, men such as Thomas of Lancaster, Guy of Warwick, and Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, resolved that the kingdom could no longer suffer the Gascon's presence. To them, Gaveston was not simply an upstart or a nuisance. He was the embodiment of royal defiance, the living symbol of Edward's unwillingness to submit to their demands. Removing him was no longer a matter of principle, but a necessity. Edward, blinded by devotion, believed he could protect his friend. He restored Gaveston once more to his side, granting him castles, offices, and the public honors that proclaimed him not merely as companion, but as a partner in rule. Together, they moved through the realm as though baronial anger were of no consequence. Yet beneath the surface, plans were forming. The barons, armed and united, prepared to seize the man who had so thoroughly captured the king's heart and so thoroughly insulted their pride. The capture came swiftly. Gaveston, traveling with limited escort, found himself cornered by the Earl of Warwick and his allies. Betrayed by fortune and outmatched in force, he could not escape. He was taken into custody, and the nobility, unwilling to risk the long delays of negotiation or the uncertain mercy of law, determined to act without waiting for royal consent. The king's favorite, who had so often defied exile and triumphed over banishment, was now entirely in their hands. What followed was not the formal trial of a peer, but the grim decision of a faction. To the barons, the law seemed less important than the symbolism of swift justice. They believed that every day Gaveston lived, the authority of the ordinances was mocked and the dignity of the nobility diminished. So they chose a path that bypassed council and crown alike. They condemned him in their own circle, declaring that for the good of the kingdom he must die. On a June day, Gaveston was led from custody to meet his fate. There was no long procession of heralds, no voice of a judge, no parchment bearing the seal of law. Instead, there was the determination of men who believed themselves guardians of the realm, acting in the name of England against the weakness of its king. In that act, Gaveston's life ended, and with it ended the fragile hope that reconciliation between Edward and his barons might still be possible. The news struck Edward with the force of devastation. For years he had clung to Gaveston against the tide of baronial opposition, believing that love, loyalty, and persistence could prevail over hostility. Now that hope lay shattered. Chroniclers record his grief as profound, a sorrow that seemed to eclipse every other concern. He mourned not only a companion, but the single figure who had given him solace in a world of suspicion. At his side no longer stood the witty Gascon who had filled the royal court with laughter and music, but the silence of absence. Edward's tears became more than a private lament. They were a spectacle that the realm could not ignore. To many, the king's weeping over Gaveston's body symbolized the dangerous imbalance of his reign, the extent to which personal affection had overtaken the duties of monarchy. To others, it revealed the tragedy of a man trapped by love in a position that demanded ruthless distance. In either case, the death of Gaveston was no longer just a personal calamity. It had become a national drama, one that exposed the rift between crown and nobility in the most painful of forms. The barons, for their part, justified their deed as a blow struck for the Commonwealth. They declared that England could not endure the tyranny of a favorite who manipulated the king and mocked the lords. Yet in their haste to eliminate Gaveston, they had also revealed their contempt for royal authority itself. By killing him without trial, they demonstrated that the nobility could overstep both crown and law when it suited their will. In doing so, they weakened the very monarchy they claimed to preserve. Edward's reaction was as defiant as it was grief-stricken. He swore that those responsible would be punished, that the betrayal of trust and the insult to kingship would not go unanswered. But though he vowed revenge, the reality was harsher. The barons were too powerful, their support too widespread for immediate retribution. The king's fury could not yet find an outlet. Instead, it smoldered, feeding the bitterness that would mark the next stage of his reign. The death of Piers Gaveston thus became the turning point of Edward II's kingship. It stripped him of his closest companion, revealed the extent of his isolation, and etched into the memory of the realm the image of a monarch undone by devotion. No longer could his reign be described as merely troubled or divided. It was now marked by open enmity, by the blood of a favorite, and by the tears of a king. For the chroniclers and poets of the age, the scene carried the weight of tragedy. Edward kneeling by the lifeless form of Gaveston, weeping for the man who had been both his joy and his downfall, seemed less a king than a figure from a drama, caught between love and duty, between loyalty and law. What had once been the laughter of companionship now lay silent, and what had once been a private bond had become the cause of national rupture. Thus, in the summer of 1312, England crossed a threshold. Gaveston was gone, but his absence haunted the court more than his presence ever had. Edward's grief became the emblem of a reign in conflict, and his vow of vengeance signaled that the struggle between king and barons was far from over. The friendship that had once given him comfort had transformed into a symbol of division. And from this moment onward, the story of Edward II would carry the shadow of Gaveston's fate. After the death of Piers Gaveston, the kingdom did not find peace. Instead, Edward II found himself more isolated than ever before. His grief, so openly displayed, widened the gulf between him and the nobility. To the barons, the king's tears over his companion seemed to confirm what they had long suspected. Edward was a man ruled more by affection than by judgment, more by private sentiment than by the public duties of his office. In their eyes, he could not be trusted to govern wisely, nor could he be relied upon to uphold the authority of the crown in a manner befitting his station. From this moment, distrust hardened into something deeper, The great lords no longer looked to Edward as their leader, but rather as a figure to be managed, constrained, and even opposed. Their confidence in the monarchy had withered, and with it, the natural bond between king and magnates that was meant to sustain the realm. Where Edward I had commanded loyalty through fear and strength, Edward II was now surrounded by suspicion and doubt. In council, his words carried little weight. In the field, his presence inspired little faith. The situation was worsened by his record in war. Scotland, the old battlefield of his father's ambition, continued to defy English arms. The barons remembered the humiliating disbandment of the army in 1307 and saw in it the root of their present troubles. Edward's failures against Robert the Bruce became the measure of his inadequacy. Campaign after campaign ended not in triumph, but in retreat, and each defeat further eroded the respect of his subjects. In a kingdom where martial success was the currency of kingship, Edward found himself bankrupt. The memory of Bannockburn in particular loomed like a shadow over his reputation. Though it would come in 1314, the anticipation of disaster was already in the air. The nobility had little faith in Edward's leadership, and soldiers whispered doubts about whether their king could ever match the iron will of Longshanks. The crown, once the source of strength and unity, now seemed fragile, undermined by the very man who wore it. Edward's political isolation was not simply the product of baronial resentment. It was also the result of his own inability to bridge the divide. Rather than seeking reconciliation, he often retreated further into the company of new favorites, men who promised loyalty but provoked more hostility. The barons, seeing this pattern repeated, concluded that the king had learned nothing from the tragedy of Gaveston. To them, Edward appeared incapable of ruling with independence or wisdom, forever bound to those who flattered him rather than to the broader needs of the realm. This isolation extended beyond politics into the fabric of everyday governance. Royal justice, once strengthened under Edward I, weakened as local lords asserted themselves. Taxation, already resented, became harder to impose without baronial cooperation. Parliament, instead of serving as a partner to the crown, began to act more like a tribunal, lecturing and restricting the king at every turn. The balance of power in England was shifting away from a monarchy that commanded respect and toward a nobility that sensed its own authority growing. And yet, Edward himself remained blind to the depth of this alienation. He could not fully grasp that the very institution of kingship was losing its foundation. In his mind, loyalty and affection were still the cornerstones of rule. But to the magnates of England, kingship required strength, victory, and the ability to stand above private ties. Each day that Edward failed to embody those qualities, his isolation deepened until he stood not as the leader of his realm, but as a man apart, mistrusted by his nobles, doubted by his soldiers, and overshadowed by the memory of a father whose shadow he could never escape. Thus, in the years following Gaveston's death, Edward II's reign drifted further into crisis. The personal tragedy that had broken his heart also broke the fragile trust between king and kingdom. The barons saw weakness where once they had seen a crown. The people saw defeat where once they had seen triumph. And Edward himself, caught between grief and stubbornness, seemed unable to alter his course. The stage was set for even greater disasters, for the kingdom would not long endure a monarch so isolated from those who were meant to uphold him. In the years after Gaveston's death and the king's growing estrangement from his lords, the northern frontier again drew England's attention. Scotland, long the battlefield of Edward IC's ambition, was not subdued, but alive with renewed energy. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 had seemed to mark the end of serious resistance, yet in truth, it only cleared the stage for another figure, one whose determination and skill would prove far greater. Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306, emerged as the leader who transformed scattered rebellion into a coherent struggle for independence. Bruce was not a newcomer to politics or war. He belonged to one of the great families of Scotland, long torn between loyalty to England and the call of national sovereignty. When he seized the crown, it was at great personal risk, for Edward I had declared him an outlaw and enemy. Yet by the time Edward II inherited his father's throne, Bruce had already begun to consolidate his power. Through daring raids, quick strikes, and the careful use of terrain, he wore down English garrisons and reclaimed castles one by one. By 1310, Scotland was stirring with a new confidence. Wallace had embodied defiance, but Bruce embodied strategy. His leadership unified the clans and nobles who had once been divided. He avoided large battles when he could not win, striking instead with agility, forcing the English to chase him through mountains and forests, exhausting them in a land that favored the defender. To the Scots, he was not simply a king, but a symbol of national survival. To the English, he became a constant irritation, a reminder that the conquest envisioned by Longshanks was slipping away. Edward II inherited this unfinished war, but lacked the resolve or skill to bring it to conclusion. Where his father had marched relentlessly north with heavy armies, Edward vacillated. He raised troops, then disbanded them. He summoned magnates to war, then quarreled with them over loyalty and obedience. The barons, already alienated by his favoritism and failures, gave him little support. Many remembered the heavy costs of earlier campaigns and saw no reason to sacrifice further under a king they did not trust. Meanwhile, Bruce advanced. His victories grew bolder, his following stronger. He reclaimed territory not only by force but by persuasion, binding men to his cause through oaths of loyalty and the promise of a Scotland free from English overlordship. Castles once garrisoned with English troops fell into his hands, sometimes through siege, sometimes through desertion, as morale among Edward's men withered. By 1312, Scotland was no longer a land of scattered rebellion, but a kingdom in revival, its king increasingly secure, its people increasingly united. For Edward, this resurgence was a humiliation. He had inherited from his father the title of Lord Paramount of Scotland, a claim to dominance that now rang hollow. His father had demanded that Bruce be crushed, yet under his son's watch, Bruce was thriving. The English crown, once feared across the border, now seemed hesitant and uncertain. Each year that Bruce remained on the throne was a year that mocked Edward's weakness. Chroniclers noted the contrast. Edward I had pursued Bruce as a fugitive. Edward II faced him as a monarch in his own right. The transformation spoke not only of Bruce's resilience, but of England's decline. Where once Scotland trembled under invasion, it now dared to challenge openly, emboldened by a king who embodied the hopes of his people. Thus, as the second decade of the 14th century unfolded, the conflict in Scotland became the measure of Edward's failing authority. His inability to crush Bruce diminished him in the eyes of his nobles, and diminished England in the eyes of Europe. The barons who already doubted him saw in each Scottish victory another proof that their king was unfit to lead. The soldiers who marched north returned weary and disillusioned, and Robert the Bruce, once an outlaw hunted in the heather, stood now as a sovereign who could dream of full independence. The stage was set for a reckoning, a battle that would decide not only the fate of Scotland's crown, but also the reputation of Edward II. That reckoning would come at Bannockburn, but already in the campaigns that preceded it, the outcome seemed written in the fabric of Edward's failures and Bruce's resolve. The summer of 1314 brought Edward II to the most fateful moment of his reign. For years, Robert the Bruce had been reclaiming his kingdom, dismantling English garrisons, and strengthening his position as King of Scots. The pressure on Edward mounted until it could no longer be ignored. Stirling Castle, one of the last strongholds of English power in Scotland, was under siege, and its constable had promised to surrender if relief did not arrive by midsummer. To abandon Stirling would be to concede that Scotland was lost. To march north was to risk everything on the outcome of a single campaign. Edward chose to march. The army he gathered was vast, perhaps 20,000 strong, the largest host England had raised in a generation. Knights in shining armor rode at the head, banners snapping in the summer wind, infantry and archers forming endless lines. It was a show of force meant to remind the Scots of England's wealth and might. Yet beneath the pageantry lay uncertainty. Many of the great barons who accompanied Edward distrusted his judgment, resentful still of past quarrels. The cohesion that had once held English armies together under Longshanks was absent. They were numerous, but they were not united. Robert the Bruce, by contrast, brought fewer than 6,000 men to the field. His army was small, but it was hardened by years of fighting, disciplined, and guided by a leader who knew the land intimately. Bruce had no illusions about overwhelming the English with numbers. Instead, he relied on preparation, cunning, and the spirit of men defending their homeland. He chose his ground with care. The fields near Bannockburn, where marshy terrain and narrow approaches would blunt the force of the enemy's cavalry. It was a battlefield that favored patience, not reckless charge. The two armies faced each other in late June. On the eve of battle, Edward's camp was filled with noise, confidence, and perhaps complacency. The size of his host gave him assurance that victory was inevitable. But Bruce inspired his smaller force with words of defiance and the promise that they fought not for conquest, but for freedom. For the Scots, every man in the line had a stake in the outcome. For the English, the campaign was another test of loyalty to a king they did not trust. The fighting began with a moment that became legend. A Scottish knight, Henry de Bohun, spotted Bruce on horseback and charged at him, lance lowered, certain of victory. Bruce, armed only with an axe, turned to meet him. With calm precision, he struck Bohun down, and the morale of the Scots soared. It was not merely the fall of a knight, but the triumph of a king who showed himself fearless before his men. In that single act, Bruce demonstrated the leadership that Edward lacked, a monarch willing to fight alongside his soldiers, to embody the courage he asked of them. The battle unfolded over 2 days. Edward's plan was simple: use his superior cavalry to smash the Scottish lines and open the way to Stirling. But the ground betrayed him. The fields were soft, rutted, and thick with mud. Bruce's men had dug concealed pits and laid obstacles to disrupt the charge. When the English knights spurred forward, their horses floundered, their formations broke apart, and the narrow spaces funneled them into chaos. Instead of sweeping across the field, they found themselves trapped, pressed on all sides by disciplined Scottish spearmen. Archers who might have turned the tide were poorly deployed. Confusion spread through the English ranks as command faltered. Edward, lacking the authority of his father, failed to impose order. His voice carried no weight amid the tumult, and his barons acted with divided purpose. Some pressed forward recklessly, others held back, unwilling to risk themselves for a king they resented. The cohesion of the army dissolved, and what had begun as a confident advance turned into a desperate struggle for survival. On the second day, the Scots pressed their advantage. Compact formations of spearmen advanced steadily, driving the English back toward the Bannockburn, the small stream that gave the battlefield its name. Cavalry, once the pride of England, found themselves mired in mud, unable to maneuver. Horses stumbled, riders fell, and discipline disintegrated. Panic rippled through the ranks. What had begun as the greatest army England could muster now began to unravel. The rout that followed was swift and humiliating. English soldiers fled in disorder, many abandoning their weapons as they tried to escape. The fields were strewn with discarded armor, the symbols of a shattered pride. Stirling Castle, the prize Edward had come to save, surrendered shortly after, confirming the completeness of the defeat. The consequences of Bannockburn were profound. Robert the Bruce emerged not merely as a rebel king, but as the uncontested ruler of Scotland. His victory gave his cause legitimacy in the eyes of Europe, and his people embraced him as the savior of their independence. For Edward II, the battle was a disaster beyond measure. His great army had been humiliated by a smaller force, his authority mocked by failure, and his reputation as a king reduced to ashes. The image of Bannockburn lingered in memory. Armored knights trapped in mud, banners trampled in retreat, the once mighty host scattering before men who fought with conviction rather than numbers. For Edward, it was the culmination of years of weakness, a demonstration of all that separated him from the iron will of his father. Where Longshanks had struck fear into nations, Edward inspired only doubt. Where Bruce led with courage and cunning, Edward faltered, his commands drowned in the chaos of defeat. Bannockburn was not only a Scottish triumph, but an English reckoning. It revealed that numbers alone could not guarantee victory, that a king without the confidence of his men could not command success. It marked the moment when Edward's reign became irreversibly tarnished, the point at which he was no longer merely distrusted, but openly derided. From that muddy field in June 1314, the story of Edward II would be written not as the chronicle of a king in strength, but as the lament of a monarch undone by his own failings. The aftermath of Bannockburn was nothing short of catastrophic for Edward II. The grand army he had assembled, the largest England had seen in years, had dissolved into chaos, and with it, so too did the remnants of his authority. The news of defeat spread quickly across Europe, shocking allies and emboldening enemies. For Scotland, the victory marked not just the survival of resistance, but the birth of independence. For England, it was the moment when Edward's reputation, already fragile, collapsed entirely. The victory cemented Robert the Bruce's place as Scotland's undisputed king. No longer could he be dismissed as a rebel chieftain or an outlaw. He had met the might of England in open battle and prevailed. The Scottish nobles, who once hesitated, now flocked to his side, pledging their allegiance to a monarch who had proven his right to rule. Across the realm, his people hailed him as the champion who had secured their freedom. Stirling's fall confirmed what Bannockburn had already decided. Scotland was free to govern itself, and the English grip over the north had been broken. For Edward, the contrast was brutal. He had set out to crush Bruce and to restore his father's legacy of dominance. Instead, he returned humiliated, fleeing with what remained of his household guard while his great host scattered. The chroniclers of the time did not spare him. They described the disaster with tones of astonishment, portraying Edward as a king who could muster numbers but not loyalty, who could command men to march but not inspire them to fight. His failings were laid bare for all to see, and no amount of royal ceremony could mask them. The English nobility, already resentful of Edward's choices and skeptical of his competence, now had irrefutable proof of his inadequacy. To them, Bannockburn was not merely a defeat, it was a confirmation of everything they had feared. They had lost sons and fortune in the king's service, only to see it squandered through poor leadership. Around their halls and councils, whispers grew louder that Edward lacked the qualities of a monarch. He had neither the judgment of his father nor the charisma to command respect. The trust that might once have been salvaged was now gone. Among the common people, too, the consequences were profound. Defeat meant heavier taxes, greater insecurity on the borders, and the humiliation of belonging to a kingdom that had failed so spectacularly. Where once English arms had carried pride abroad, now they carried shame. The king's image suffered not only in noble courts, but in the taverns and marketplaces where his name became linked with failure. Even those who had little care for politics could sense the decline. Internationally, England's standing was shaken. France, long a rival and occasional adversary, observed the weakness with keen interest. Other powers of Europe now saw Scotland not as a province to be conquered, but as a kingdom restored, worthy of diplomacy. Bruce's envoys could negotiate with authority, while Edward's diplomats carried the burden of humiliation. The Plantagenet claim to overlordship of Scotland, once shouted with iron conviction, now rang hollow. For Edward himself, the psychological blow was immense. He had dreamed of proving himself against the memory of his father, of showing the world that he could lead armies and command victories. Bannockburn shattered that dream. His reign, already troubled by division, was now defined by disgrace. He could not erase the image of his cavalry mired in mud, his soldiers fleeing in panic, his banners trampled beneath Scottish spears. Those scenes lived on in the minds of his people and became the measure of his kingship. The consequences stretched far beyond the battlefield. Within England, the nobility tightened their grip, emboldened by the king's weakness. They no longer felt bound by loyalty to a monarch who had failed them. Instead, they sought to manage or even control him, reducing his freedom to rule. Parliament became increasingly assertive, demanding greater oversight and limiting royal power. Edward's isolation deepened, and his court grew more dependent on the narrow circle of favorites who remained loyal. It was a vicious cycle. The more he clung to those few he trusted, the more alienated the realm became. Bannockburn, therefore, was not only a military defeat, but a turning point in the story of Edward II. It destroyed what little credibility he still possessed. It confirmed Scotland's independence, and it convinced the nobility that their king was unfit to wear the crown he inherited. The years that followed would not heal these wounds. Instead, they would fester, setting the stage for rebellion, betrayal, and the final tragedy of a monarch undone by his own inadequacies. In the years following Bannockburn, Edward II's reign entered an even darker chapter. The defeat had left him vulnerable, his prestige shattered, and his nobles more confident than ever in their belief that the crown could no longer be trusted to govern wisely. Out of this climate of disillusionment rose a new opposition, one that would define the next stage of his rule. At its center stood Thomas of Lancaster, cousin to the king, a man of immense wealth and influence who became the figurehead of rebellion. Thomas of Lancaster was no ordinary baron. Through inheritance and marriage, he commanded vast estates stretching across England, and his household rivaled the crown itself in wealth and retainers. His lineage connected him to the royal family, giving him a stature that few could match. In Lancaster, the disaffected lords saw their leader, a man strong enough to challenge the king, bold enough to demand accountability, and proud enough to stand as the guardian of noble privilege against royal misrule. The grievances of the nobility were by now well known. They had endured the humiliation of Bannockburn, the costly failures in Scotland, and the burden of taxation that brought no reward. They had watched the crown squander its authority in the embrace of favorites, first Piers Gaveston and now, ominously, another pair, Hugh Despenser the elder and his ambitious son, Hugh the younger. To the lords, the Despensers were a new incarnation of the same pattern, a narrow circle of courtiers elevated far beyond their station, feeding on royal favor while alienating the realm. Edward, however, clung to them with the same loyalty he had once shown Gaveston. The Despensers, shrewd and calculating, gave him what he craved most: devotion. The elder Despenser, experienced and cautious, offered counsel that flattered the king's sense of dignity. The younger, fierce and relentless, became Edward's close companion, rising swiftly in wealth and authority. Together, they came to dominate the royal court, guiding policy, securing lands, and drawing the ire of every magnate who felt excluded or dishonored. By 1320, resentment had hardened into open hostility. Lancaster and his allies framed their cause as the defense of the kingdom against tyranny and corruption. They portrayed the king not as a sovereign in his own right, but as a man enslaved to unworthy advisers. Parliament became the stage where these accusations rang out, and petitions multiplied, demanding that the Despensers be cast down. To the barons, removing them was not merely about personal hatred. It was about rescuing England from another cycle of favoritism that had already destroyed royal credibility. Edward, unwilling to abandon those he trusted, resisted. To yield to the barons was to repeat the humiliation of Gaveston's exile, and Edward had sworn never again to see his household dictated by noble hostility. The clash became inevitable. Lancaster marshaled support across the Midlands and the North, gathering a coalition of earls who declared themselves defenders of the realm. Edward, meanwhile, leaned ever more heavily on the Despensers, rewarding them with estates confiscated from their enemies, binding his fate to theirs in a spiral of dependency. The kingdom braced itself for conflict. Roads filled with armed retainers, castles bristled with defenses, and the land groaned under the weight of feuds that could no longer be contained. The memory of Bannockburn still haunted England, but now the threat was no longer only from Scotland. The danger lay within the realm itself, where the king and his magnates stood on the brink of civil war. And at the heart of it all was the same pattern that had defined Edward's reign from the beginning. A monarch isolated, clinging to a few chosen companions, and a nobility unwilling to accept rule by favorites. Thus, the struggle entered a new phase. Gaveston was gone, but in the Despensers, the nobility saw his shadow reborn. For Edward, they were indispensable. For Lancaster and his allies, they were intolerable. Between these two visions of kingship, England once again drifted toward upheaval, and the fate of Edward II grew more precarious with each passing year. From 1318 onward, the reign of Edward II entered what chroniclers later called the Despenser years. If Piers Gaveston had been the first favorite whose presence shattered harmony between crown and nobles, then the Despensers were something more. Not merely companions, but rulers in all but name. Hugh Despenser the elder and his son, Hugh the younger, came to dominate the royal court with an authority that eclipsed all others. They were not content with royal affection alone. They sought lands, wealth, and political supremacy, and they pursued these ambitions with relentless determination. The younger Despenser in particular rose like a storm. Ambitious, ruthless in his dealings, and skilled in the arts of courtly manipulation, he became indispensable to Edward. His sharp tongue and cunning strategies flattered the king, giving Edward the sense of decisiveness he so often lacked. But what Edward saw as loyalty, the nobility saw as arrogance and tyranny. The younger Despenser used his influence not only to accumulate vast estates, especially along the Welsh marches, but also to settle old scores. He pursued claims to land through dubious legal maneuvers, seizing the property of rival barons and driving families from their inheritance. The elder Despenser, more cautious in temperament, supported his son's ambitions and lent them the appearance of legitimacy. Together, they constructed a network of power that reached into every corner of government. They appointed sheriffs and justices loyal to their cause, manipulated courts to secure verdicts favorable to their interests, and exploited the royal treasury as though it were their own. Their rise created a new aristocracy within the aristocracy, a faction that wielded the crown as its weapon and turned politics into a tool of personal enrichment. For the barons who had endured years of frustration under Gaveston, the Despenser regime was intolerable. If Gaveston had mocked them with nicknames and flamboyant displays, the Despensers wounded them more deeply by stripping them of wealth and authority. Lands along the Welsh border were confiscated, sometimes under the pretense of law, sometimes through outright intimidation. Families with centuries of heritage found themselves reduced or displaced. While the Despensers tightened their grip, the resentment was not confined to the nobility. Merchants, townsmen, and common folk all felt the burden of their avarice, whether through increased exactions, arbitrary justice, or the simple reality that the court now served a family rather than a kingdom. The climate of fear grew steadily. Those who opposed the Despensers risked not only political defeat, but financial ruin. Their network of officials ensured that rebellion could be punished with confiscation, exile, or worse. Where Edward might once have mediated between factions, he now aligned himself wholly with his favorites, defending them at every turn. In doing so, he placed the monarchy itself on one side of the conflict. To attack the Despensers was to attack the king, and to resist the king was to court treason. Thus, the cycle of hostility deepened, pulling the realm ever closer to civil war. The years between 1318 and 1326 became, in essence, a reign within a reign. Edward was the crowned monarch, but the Despensers were the architects of power. Their control over royal patronage reshaped the political map of England. Castles changed hands not through conquest, but by decree. Estates once secure under noble families fell into Despenser possession. Every transaction of land seemed to carry their shadow, every judgment of court their signature. Chroniclers described their governance as a stranglehold, binding king and country alike. Edward himself seemed blind to the danger. To him, the Despensers represented steadfast loyalty in a world of shifting alliances. They offered him companionship, advice, and above all, the appearance of authority. Where Lancaster and the barons questioned his right to rule effectively, the Despensers reassured him that he was strong, decisive, and rightful. In their presence, Edward felt the weight of kingship lightened, but in clinging to them, he alienated nearly every other pillar of the realm. By the mid-1320s, hatred of the Despensers had become universal. Noble houses resented their losses, merchants railed against their demands, and even the clergy murmured against their greed. What had begun as favoritism had grown into domination, and what had once been rivalry had hardened into vendetta. The kingdom seethed with quiet rage, waiting only for a spark. Thus, the Despenser years became the crucible of Edward's downfall. They were years of ruthless consolidation, of unchecked ambition, of a court transformed into an engine of private gain. For the nobility, it was the final proof that Edward had abandoned his role as King of all England, choosing instead to be the patron of one family. For the people, it was the visible sign of corruption at the heart of governance. And for Edward himself, it was the tragic repetition of a pattern that had haunted his reign from the start. Loyalty to his favorites, devotion that blinded him, and the steady erosion of the crown he was sworn to defend. In the early months of 1322, the long-brewing conflict between Edward II and his greatest magnates erupted into open war. For years, Thomas of Lancaster had positioned himself as the protector of England against royal misrule, cloaking his ambitions in the language of reform. He rallied earls and barons alike, forging alliances with those dispossessed by the Despencer's greed. The rebellion gained strength in the Midlands and the North, where Lancaster's vast estates provided both resources and men. It seemed for a moment that the nobility might succeed in curbing the crown once and for all. But rebellion, however righteous in its cause, requires unity. And here Lancaster faltered. Though powerful, he was an uncertain commander, more comfortable in council chambers than on the battlefield. His coalition was divided, torn by rivalries, and hampered by poor coordination. Against this disjointed opposition, Edward, fortified by the loyalty of the Despensers, saw his chance. For once in his reign, the king acted with decisive clarity. In March 1322, the two sides clashed at Boroughbridge, a small but decisive encounter that altered the balance of the realm. Lancaster's forces, numbering in the thousands, attempted to block Edward's advance by holding the bridge across the River Ure. Yet Edward's commanders, experienced and ruthless, exploited their advantage. The rebels found themselves trapped between river and crown forces, unable to maneuver, their resistance collapsing under the pressure of disciplined royal troops. The battle was brief, and the outcome unmistakable. Lancaster's army was broken, the rebellion crushed. Lancaster himself was captured. His defiance ended not with a sweeping victory, but in the ignominy of surrender. For a man who had styled himself as the conscience of the realm, the champion of ordinances and noble privilege, the humiliation was immense. He was brought before a hastily assembled tribunal, dominated by Edward's allies and the Despensers themselves. The verdict was predetermined. Lancaster was condemned as a traitor, and soon after, he was executed. The death of Thomas of Lancaster was a turning point. His execution sent shockwaves across the realm, for he was not merely another baron, but the wealthiest and most powerful magnate in England, cousin to the king, a man whose bloodline tied him to the very heart of the Plantagenet dynasty. For many, his fall symbolized the triumph of royal authority, proof that even the greatest of the realm could not stand against the crown. For Edward, it seemed at last a moment of vindication, the end of years of humiliation at the hands of a rival who had mocked his weakness. Yet the triumph was hollow. Though Lancaster was gone, the grievances that had fueled rebellion remained. The Despensers, more entrenched than ever, wielded power with increasing severity. The confiscated estates of Lancaster and his allies were parceled out among the king's favorites, deepening resentment. Far from reconciling the nobility to his rule, Edward had merely silenced one voice of opposition while amplifying the fury of countless others. The people, too, did not forget. Though Lancaster's rebellion had ended in defeat, his image began to transform in the popular imagination. Chroniclers recorded murmurs that he was a martyr, a nobleman who had stood against tyranny and paid the ultimate price. Pilgrimages began to his tomb, prayers offered as though he were a saint. His death, far from extinguishing resistance, gave it a symbol around which discontent could rally. Edward and the Despensers mistook their victory for security. They believed the realm was now subdued, that the crown had finally broken the will of its enemies. But beneath the surface, the kingdom seethed. The nobility chafed under Despencer dominance, towns groaned under exactions, and the memory of Bannockburn still hung like a shadow over the monarchy. Instead of strengthening the crown, Boroughbridge revealed its fragility. Edward could win a battle, but he could not win trust. He could execute a rival, but he could not restore respect. Thus, the fall of Thomas of Lancaster, intended as a triumph for Edward II, became instead another step toward his undoing. The rebellion was crushed, yet the king remained despised. The execution of his cousin secured the dominance of the Despensers, but at the cost of isolating the crown further from its people. What Edward could not see, what history would make clear, is that the victory at Boroughbridge was not the salvation of his reign, but its prelude to tragedy. In the years after Boroughbridge, Edward II might have believed he had secured his throne. His most dangerous rival was dead, the Despensers stood triumphant, and the nobility for the moment cowed. Yet from within his own household rose a figure whose discontent would prove far more dangerous than Lancaster's rebellion. Isabella of France, Edward's queen and daughter of Philip IV, had long been a silent partner in his troubled reign. But by the 1320s, her patience with her husband and his favorites had eroded into bitterness. Once a dutiful consort, she began to transform into a determined adversary. Isabella's marriage to Edward had been more than a union of two people. It was the binding of two dynasties. As daughter of the mighty King of France, she brought prestige and the promise of peace between two rival kingdoms. In her youth, she had been celebrated for her beauty, intelligence, and poise. Chroniclers described her as a woman of grace, one who understood both the art of diplomacy and the demands of queenship. In her early years at court, she had stood by Edward despite the presence of Gaveston, playing her role with dignity, even as whispers of her husband's attachments spread across Europe. But the rise of the Despensers changed everything. Unlike Gaveston, whose flamboyance provoked mockery, the Despensers wielded raw power that struck directly at Isabella's dignity and authority. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, treated the queen with cold contempt, seizing her revenues, interfering with her lands, and excluding her from influence. Estates traditionally granted to queens of England were absorbed into the Despensers' holdings, leaving Isabella dependent on their goodwill. It was not merely a political insult, but a personal humiliation, one that undermined her station and wounded her pride as daughter of a Capetian king. Edward, blinded by loyalty, did nothing to restrain his favorites. In fact, he often sided with them in disputes, disregarding his wife's grievances. To Isabella, this betrayal cut deeply. She had stood by her husband in the face of his barons. She had served as peacemaker in moments of crisis, and she had borne him children, ensuring the succession of the crown. Yet in return, she found herself sidelined, her rights stripped away, her voice ignored. What began as frustration hardened into resentment, and resentment into hatred. By the mid-1320s, Isabella's position at court was intolerable. She no longer held the honor traditionally accorded to a queen consort. The Despensers watched her every move, restricting her influence and ensuring her isolation. To the nobility and to foreign envoys, it was plain that the Queen of England had been humiliated by her own husband's household. For Isabella, daughter of one of Europe's most formidable monarchs, the insult was more than personal, it was political. Her very identity as a Capetian princess demanded she not accept such treatment passively. Her disillusionment coincided with the growing chorus of discontent across the realm. The barons resented Despenser dominance, the commons groaned under taxation, the clergy whispered of injustice. Isabella became a silent mirror of the kingdom's frustrations, her plight symbolic of the wider suffering under Edward's rule. Where once she might have been a mediator, she now found herself aligned, in spirit if not yet in action, with those who sought to see the Despensers destroyed. It was in these years that Isabella's transformation began. Once loyal, even protective of Edward, she gradually turned her heart away from him. The queen, who had endured whispers and indignities, now began to imagine herself as more than a consort. She was a mother whose children's future was imperiled by a weak and despised king. She was a daughter of France, whose blood carried a legacy of power and pride, and she was a woman wronged, determined to reclaim her dignity. Edward, blind to her, growing hostility, failed to see the danger. Surrounded by the Despensers, he convinced himself that his queen remained submissive, bound by her role and her vows. He underestimated her resolve, just as he had underestimated so many before. But Isabella was no ordinary queen. In her, the realm would soon find not merely a consort, but a leader of opposition, a figure whose betrayal would eclipse all others in Edward's tragic reign. Thus, by the mid-1320s, the seeds of vengeance had been sown. The Queen of England, once the loyal partner of her husband, had turned inward, nursing a fury born of betrayal. In her silence, in her dignity, and in her gathering determination, Isabella prepared for the moment when she would strike, not as the wife of Edward, but as the destroyer of his crown. In 1325, Edward II faced a diplomatic crisis that forced him to rely on the very person who had grown to despise him. The long-standing tension between England and France over the Duchy of Aquitaine had flared once more. Charles IV, Isabella's brother, and the last son of Philip IV, pressed his claims with firmness, demanding that Edward perform homage for his French lands or risk losing them entirely. For Edward, already weakened at home, the threat of conflict with France was intolerable. He needed a negotiator who could appeal to Charles's sense of kinship, someone who could soften French resolve where English arms could not. Reluctantly, perhaps blindly, he turned to his queen. Isabella had not set foot in her homeland for many years. When she crossed the Channel in the autumn of 1325, she returned not only as Queen of England, but as a daughter of France. Her arrival was marked with ceremony, yet beneath the display lay deeper currents. She carried herself with dignity, her beauty and intelligence still commanding admiration. To her brother, she came as a sister seeking peace. To the world, she appeared the dutiful consort, working for the good of her husband's realm. But in her heart, Isabella carried the sting of betrayal, and in France she saw an opportunity to carve her own path. Charles IV welcomed her warmly, though the negotiations were tense. He demanded recognition of French sovereignty in Aquitaine, a concession Edward was loath to grant. Isabella, however, played her part with elegance. She spoke as sister and mediator, soothing tempers, buying time, and presenting herself as the voice of reason where Edward had offered only obstinacy. Her presence in Paris gave her something else as well, freedom from the suffocating grip of the dispensers. In France, she was no longer watched, no longer humiliated. Here, her words carried weight, her royal blood commanding respect that had been denied her in England. It was during this mission that fate introduced her to Roger Mortimer. Once a powerful marcher lord, Mortimer had risen in rebellion against Edward and the dispensers, only to be captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His escape in 1323, daring and improbable, had carried him into exile in France. There he lived as a dispossessed noble, nursing grievances and plotting revenge. When Isabella arrived, the paths of two embittered souls converged, the queen betrayed by her husband, and the lord betrayed by his king. Mortimer was a man of charisma and ambition, tall and commanding, hardened by defeat, but sharpened by exile. He recognized in Isabella not only a wronged woman, but a potential ally of immense power. She, in turn, saw in him the qualities her husband lacked: decisiveness, courage, and the willingness to act. Their meeting in the French court was more than chance. It was the beginning of a partnership that would alter the course of English history. Though at first their conversations were discreet, the connection between them deepened swiftly. Both spoke the language of betrayal. Both understood the need for retribution, and both sensed that together they could achieve what neither could alone. Isabella brought legitimacy, the aura of queenship, and ties to the French crown. Mortimer brought military experience, noble allies in exile, and the daring of a man with nothing left to lose. United, they formed a vision to topple the dispensers, to humble Edward, and to seize the destiny that had been denied them. Isabella's diplomatic mission achieved its surface aim. Edward's young son, the heir to the throne, was sent to France to perform homage in his father's name, preserving Aquitaine without Edward himself crossing the Channel. But beneath the appearance of diplomacy, something far more dangerous had taken root. Isabella did not return to her husband. Instead, she remained in France, her presence cloaked in courtesy but charged with defiance. Edward, still trusting or perhaps unable to imagine her betrayal, recalled her with anxious letters. She refused. Her court in Paris became a gathering place for exiles and malcontents, a shadow court of opposition against the King of England. Thus, the mission of 1325 became the turning point. Isabella had left England as a queen consort sent to negotiate peace. She stayed in France as a queen preparing for war. At her side now stood Roger Mortimer, the ally and companion who would give shape to her vengeance. What had begun as diplomacy ended as conspiracy, and from that moment the crown of Edward II trembled in earnest. By 1326, the partnership between Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer had evolved into something far more potent than diplomacy or shared resentment. What began as cautious conversations in the French court became an alliance of both passion and politics, bound together by a common purpose: the overthrow of Edward II and the destruction of the dispensers. Chroniclers of the age, often scandalized, whispered of their intimacy, yet even their disapproval could not disguise the reality. Isabella and Mortimer had become not only allies but lovers. Their union shocked contemporaries, for Isabella was not merely a queen, but the daughter of a Capetian king, expected to embody virtue and restraint. Yet her marriage had long been hollow, her dignity undermined by her husband's neglect and the humiliations inflicted by the dispensers. In Mortimer, she found what Edward had denied her: respect, admiration, and the fire of ambition. He saw her not as an ornament of the crown, but as a partner in power. Together, they forged a relationship that transcended convention, uniting their personal desires with the grand strategy of rebellion. From Paris, their conspiracy began to take form. Isabella, wielding her status as queen and sister to the French king, secured the protection of Charles IV. While Charles remained cautious, reluctant to provoke a direct war with England, he allowed his sister enough freedom to maneuver. Mortimer, meanwhile, drew upon his network of exiled English nobles, men who had lost lands and honor to the dispensers and yearned for revenge. Their household in France became a gathering place for dispossessed lords, mercenaries, and clerics sympathetic to their cause. The plan required more than anger. It required resources. Isabella and Mortimer turned their eyes to Flanders, the wealthy region across the Channel, whose towns and merchants depended heavily on English wool. There, they found willing financiers, Flemish guilds and bankers, eager to weaken Edward's regime and maintain favorable trade, offered ships, money, and soldiers. The promise of economic stability in return for political change created a powerful incentive. Slowly, the framework of invasion took shape. At the heart of this alliance was the strange and striking image of a queen in exile. Isabella presented herself not as a rebel against her husband, but as a wronged woman and a mother defending the rights of her son, the heir to the English throne. To the world, she claimed her actions were not for herself, but for the young Prince Edward, whom she kept by her side in France. This duality, queen as mother, lover as conspirator, gave her a moral shield even as she plotted the destruction of the king. Mortimer, for his part, provided the military vision. Hardened by years of border warfare and rebellion, he understood the tactics needed to raise an army from scattered supporters. He worked tirelessly to bind exiled nobles together, promising restoration of their lands and vengeance against the dispensers. His charisma and leadership gave the exiles a figure to rally around, while Isabella's presence lent legitimacy to their cause. No longer were they merely dispossessed lords. They were soldiers of a queen. By the summer of 1326, preparations were nearly complete. Ships were gathered in Flanders, funds secured, alliances forged. Letters were smuggled across the Channel to England, calling on sympathetic lords to rise when the invasion came. Discontent seethed in every corner of the kingdom, from the humiliated nobility to the common folk crushed by dispenser. Exactions. England waited only for a signal, and Isabella and Mortimer were determined to give it. Their love affair, scandalous though it seemed, became the engine of revolution. In each other, they found not only passion, but the resolve to risk everything. Isabella risked her reputation, her marriage, even her life. Mortimer risked a return to the gallows should their venture fail, yet both were willing to gamble, for the prize was immense. The crown itself wrested from a king despised by his people. Thus, in exile, a queen and a lord bound themselves together in defiance of a king. Their union embodied the intertwining of private desire and public ambition, a bond that would soon shake the foundations of England. When their fleet finally sailed from Flanders, it would not merely carry soldiers, it would carry the fury of a betrayed queen, the daring of a dispossessed noble, and the fate of Edward II himself. In the autumn of 1326, the storm that Edward II had never anticipated broke across the English coast. Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer, after months of careful planning and quiet maneuvering, set sail from Flanders with a small fleet and only a few hundred men. To outward eyes, it might have seemed a pitiful force, scarcely worthy of notice compared to the armies Edward himself had once commanded. Yet their strength did not lie in numbers. It lay in the kingdom they knew was waiting for them. The nobles disinherited by the Despensers, the clergy who had lost patience with tyranny, the common people burdened by years of misrule. Isabella and Mortimer carried not just soldiers, but the hopes of a nation desperate for change. When their ships touched the shore near Orwell in Suffolk, the invasion began almost quietly. There was no great clash of arms, no desperate resistance. Instead, there was welcome. Nobles rode to their camp, peasants brought provisions, and priests spoke openly of deliverance. The queen's arrival was heralded not as the coming of an enemy, but as the return of justice. The irony was sharp. Edward still held the crown, but Isabella carried the legitimacy. She was the daughter of France, the mother of the heir, and in the eyes of many, the wrong consort seeking to save her son's inheritance from ruin. Roger Mortimer moved swiftly to turn this sympathy into power. With Isabella at his side, he issued proclamations denouncing the Despensers and accusing Edward of abandoning the good of the realm. These words struck a chord. The years of greed, confiscation, and humiliation had left few willing to fight for the king. Within days, Isabella and Mortimer's small company swelled as disinherited lords pledged their banners, and mercenaries hired in advance joined their ranks. The countryside, weary of exactions and punishments under Despenser rule, opened its gates. The reaction of the nobility was decisive. Some of the greatest earls of England, men who had once feared Edward's wrath, now came over to Isabella's side. Their grievances against the Despensers, coupled with the humiliation of Lancaster's death and the shame of Bannockburn, made allegiance to the Queen and Mortimer not just appealing, but inevitable. Bishops, too, lent their support, casting the invasion in the light of moral duty. Sermons rang from pulpits declaring that the Queen sought not vengeance, but reform, not usurpation, but salvation of the realm. Edward at first could not believe the scale of the betrayal. Reports reached him that his wife had landed, that Mortimer was with her, that banners were gathering to their cause. He clung to the belief that loyalty to the crown would prevail, that the nobility would not abandon their anointed king. But as the days passed, the truth grew undeniable. Men deserted him in droves. Garrisons surrendered without a fight. Even within his household, loyalty faltered, whispers spreading that the cause of Isabella was just, and that Edward's reign had been poisoned by the corruption of the Despensers. For the people, the invasion carried a strange air of relief. They did not see foreign mercenaries, but their own queen, returned with her son, the boy who would one day be Edward III. To support her was to support the future of the crown, not its destruction. Crowds gathered along the roads as Isabella's forces marched, cheering rather than resisting. Chroniclers recorded that her army seemed to grow by the hour, not by conquest, but by welcome. The Despensers, once so powerful, now found themselves isolated. Their name, once a shield in court, had become a curse throughout the land. As Isabella advanced, their enemies rose up, seizing estates, tearing down symbols of their power, and demanding retribution. Edward's reliance on them had bound his fate to theirs, and as their star fell, so too did his. By the time Isabella and Mortimer reached the heart of England, they no longer commanded a few hundred soldiers, but tens of thousands. What had begun as a fragile expedition had become a popular rising, the culmination of years of grievance. Edward fled from London, panic overtaking him as he realized that his kingdom had slipped away without a single decisive battle. His authority had evaporated, not through defeat on the field, but through the collapse of loyalty. Thus, the invasion of 1326 unfolded less like a conquest and more like a coronation in waiting. Isabella, once a queen humiliated, now rode at the head of an army of supporters. Mortimer, once an exile, stood as her partner in command. And Edward II, once King of England by divine right, now found himself abandoned by his lords, his clergy, and his people. The realm had chosen its side, and it was not with the crown that sat upon his head. Edward II had known defeat before, but never had he tasted abandonment on such a scale. As Isabella and Mortimer's forces swept through the kingdom, gathering strength with each passing day, the king found himself more isolated than ever. London, once the heart of royal authority, turned against him. Nobles who had dined at his table now declared for his queen, and bishops who had once anointed him with prayers now blessed his enemies. Even the people of the city, weary of Despenser's exactions, rose in anger. The streets were no longer safe for the king who still wore England's crown. In desperation, Edward turned to the one ally who remained steadfast, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The two men fled the capital, seeking refuge in the west, where the rugged hills of Wales might provide safety and time. With them went a shrinking circle of loyal retainers, men who followed more out of duty than hope. Their flight was frantic, a mirror of the collapsing authority they left behind. Where once Edward had ridden at the head of great hosts, he now moved like a fugitive, shunned by his people, hunted by his own kingdom. The march into Wales was long and filled with fear. Each castle they passed seemed uncertain, its garrison reluctant to admit the disgraced king. Supplies dwindled, morale withered, and word reached them daily of defections. Entire towns pledged allegiance to Isabella before Edward's messengers could even arrive. The Queen and Mortimer advanced not only with soldiers, but with the tide of public will. Against such a tide, the king's frantic escape seemed less an act of strategy than of inevitability. For the Despensers, Wales had long been a bastion of influence. They hoped to rally support there, to use their Marcher holdings as a base from which to resist. But the loyalty they once commanded had been poisoned by years of greed and confiscation. When Edward and Hugh arrived, they found little welcome. Their enemies closed in, cutting off paths of retreat, and soon the last remnants of royal authority lay encircled. It was Hugh Despenser the Younger who paid the first and most dramatic price. Captured by Isabella's advancing forces, he was paraded as the symbol of all that had gone wrong in England. To the nobility and commons alike, his fall was not merely the downfall of a man, but the purging of a disease that had infected the crown. His punishment, carried out with grim ceremony, was intended as a warning. The age of Despenser domination was over. With his death, the scaffolding that had propped up Edward's reign collapsed completely. Edward himself was not executed. He was, after all, still an anointed king, consecrated with holy oil, and to spill his blood outright was to risk sacrilege. Instead, he was taken into custody, a prisoner of his queen and her allies. Stripped of power, abandoned by his household, and without his most trusted companion, Edward became a shadow of kingship, alive but dispossessed. His confinement was at once merciful and cruel. Merciful in that his life was spared, cruel in that every vestige of authority had been stripped from him. The capture of the king marked the climax of Isabella and Mortimer's triumph. No great battle had been fought. No bloody field had been strewn with corpses. The kingdom had simply turned its back on Edward, and he had crumbled. His fate was sealed not by foreign invaders, but by the will of his own people, who chose to rally behind a queen wronged rather than a king disgraced. In the chronicles, the image of Edward's downfall lingers, the once proud monarch reduced to flight, clinging to the last vestige of loyalty in a realm that had abandoned him. His retreat into Wales, his capture, and his confinement were not only the end of his reign, but the end of the illusion that he had ever truly commanded the loyalty of England. Where his father had ruled with iron will, Edward had stumbled into dependency, and when his chosen companion fell, he too was left exposed. Thus, in the winter of 1326, the reign of Edward II effectively ended. He remained alive, a prisoner king, but the crown no longer rested upon his head in anything but name. The real power belonged to Isabella and Mortimer, whose gamble had succeeded beyond expectation. England had turned its back on a monarch who had failed it, and the last act of Edward's tragedy was now unfolding in the silence of his captivity. The downfall of Edward II left England in a peculiar state, a king still alive, but stripped of all authority, and a realm that could not abide a throne without a sovereign. The machinery of government demanded resolution, and the lords, bishops, and commons looked for an answer that would preserve order while reflecting the will of the nation. That answer came not in Edward himself, but in his son, the 14-year-old Prince Edward, a boy who, in the eyes of many, embodied both innocence and hope for renewal. In January 1327, the decision was made. Edward II, confined and powerless, was compelled to relinquish the crown. The act was unprecedented, shocking in its symbolism, for it meant that the sacred bond between king and realm could be broken when a monarch failed to fulfill his duties. Yet the moment passed with startling swiftness, as though the kingdom itself were eager to close the book on his troubled reign. The crown was transferred to the young prince, who was declared Edward III, King of England. The coronation of Edward III carried the air of rebirth. Chroniclers record the enthusiasm of the people, who crowded the streets of London not to mourn the old king, but to celebrate the new. The boy king, clad in ceremonial robes, was lifted as the embodiment of a fresh beginning, a monarch untainted by the failures of his father. Bells rang, choirs sang, and the city rejoiced as if a great burden had been lifted. It was as though England itself had chosen to forget the shadow of Edward II and fix its gaze on the promise of youth. But behind the pageantry lay a more complex truth. Edward III was king in name, yet he was still a child, scarcely capable of independent rule. The real power belonged to Isabella and Mortimer, the architects of his father's fall. They styled themselves as protectors of the young monarch, guardians of his crown, but in practice they wielded authority as regents in all but title. Their word directed policy, their counsel steered diplomacy, and their allies filled the offices of government. To many, it seemed that England had exchanged one form of dominance for another, the tyranny of the dispensers replaced by the dominance of Isabella and Mortimer. Isabella, however, was careful in her public image. She presented herself as the grieving wife and devoted mother, acting not for ambition, but for the stability of the realm and the welfare of her son. To foreign envoys, she spoke of justice restored. To the clergy, she invoked the sanctity of preserving the crown for the rightful heir. Her skill in blending personal grievance with public duty gave her a legitimacy that few could challenge. Mortimer, less subtle, stood beside her as the instrument of her power. His presence was a reminder that the Queen's victory was not hers alone, but forged in partnership with the man who had become both her companion and her political equal. For Edward III, the early days of his reign were marked by ceremony rather than decision. He attended councils, received homage, and lent his name to royal charters, but the substance of government remained in other hands. Those who knelt before him knew that their oaths were directed as much to Isabella and Mortimer as to the boy before them. Yet in the enthusiasm of the moment, few cared. The mere fact of a new king, young and unspoiled, seemed to promise a better age. Thus the year 1327 opened with both celebration and uncertainty. England had a new king, but it was governed by the will of a queen and her ally. Edward II lingered in captivity, a living reminder of the fragility of kingship, while his son wore the crown that had slipped from his grasp. The balance of power had shifted dramatically, and for the moment Isabella and Mortimer stood triumphant. But in the silent eyes of the boy king, watching and learning, the seeds of another reckoning were already taking root, seeds that in time would bring the story full circle. Edward II's abdication in 1327 did not end his story. Though the crown now rested on the head of his 14-year-old son, the former king remained alive, a dangerous reality in a kingdom where loyalty could shift as quickly as the tide. In his very existence lay the possibility of conspiracy, an anointed monarch displaced, a living alternative for any faction unhappy with the rule of Isabella and Mortimer. For that reason, Edward was not free to retire into obscurity. Instead, he was led away. A prisoner of his queen, watched not only as a man disgraced, but as a symbol whose shadow threatened the new regime. At first, Edward was confined in Kenilworth Castle, a fortress of solid stone surrounded by a great mirror. There, he lived in a curious twilight state, no longer a king, but not yet entirely forgotten. He was treated with the respect due to his consecration, served meals in relative comfort, allowed attendance, kept in chambers befitting his station, but he was also carefully guarded. Visitors were few, letters fewer still. Every aspect of his life was regulated, for the lords who had forced his abdication knew that a whisper of his freedom could spark rebellion. In Kenilworth, Edward's world shrank to the rhythm of captivity. The man who had once commanded thousands now walked the battlements alone, gazing out over the waters that hemmed him in. Chroniclers record that he prayed often, attended Mass with diligence, and lapsed into long silences. He was only 43, yet the burdens of failure weighed heavily upon him. The laughter and music that had once filled his halls were replaced by the stillness of guarded corridors. For a king whose nature had leaned toward companionship and affection, isolation was its own form of torment. Meanwhile, Isabella and Mortimer tightened their hold on England. They ruled in the name of Edward III, but their authority was resented. Heavy taxes, the redistribution of forfeited estates, and Mortimer's arrogance stirred discontent. Among the barons, whispers began to circulate. Might not the old king, alive and waiting in his prison, be restored? For Isabella and Mortimer, the thought was intolerable. Their triumph would never be secure so long as Edward lived. By the summer of 1327, plots to rescue the former king were rumored across the realm. Letters were intercepted, nobles arrested, retainers questioned. Each rumor deepened Mortimer's suspicion, and Isabella's determination hardened. In September, Edward was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a more remote and more secure fortress. There, surrounded by marshes and guarded by men loyal to Mortimer, the former king's captivity grew harsher. No longer treated with the courtesy of Kenilworth, he was placed under closer watch, his attendants replaced by strangers. The transition marked a grim shift, from the respectful detention of a deposed monarch to the imprisonment of a man whose very existence had become inconvenient. At Berkeley, Edward's decline became more pronounced. Accounts speak of neglect, of poor conditions, of a deliberate attempt to break his spirit. Food was said to be served in ways that left him weakened, his health deteriorating. The once proud king was reduced to a figure of pity, stripped of dignity, fading into obscurity. Yet his plight did not erase him from the imagination of the realm. In fact, it made him more dangerous. Stories of his suffering spread, turning him into a figure of sympathy. To some, he was no longer a failed ruler, but a wronged man, unjustly cast down. This transformation of perception haunted Isabella and Mortimer. Their legitimacy rested on the claim that Edward had been unfit to rule, that the welfare of the realm demanded his replacement, but as long as he lived, there remained the risk that factions could rally around him. The presence of his son on the throne provided continuity, but the existence of the father in chains was a perpetual invitation to unrest. In September of 1327, word reached the court that Edward was dead. The announcement was delivered with solemnity, wrapped in ritual as though to sanctify an ending long in the making. His body, it was said, was carried to Gloucester Abbey, where it was interred with appropriate honors. Yet even at the time, rumors swirled. Some claimed he had died of natural causes, broken by imprisonment. Others whispered of darker means, of an end hastened by those who could not risk his survival. Chroniclers diverged. A few accepted the official account, but many suggested foul play cloaked in silence. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. With Edward's death, Isabella and Mortimer's regime felt secure at last. The living symbol of opposition was gone, and the boy king Edward III could reign without the shadow of his father looming over him. Yet the manner of Edward II's end, shrouded in secrecy and suspicion, left a stain that would never fully fade. The very murkiness of his fate ensured that his memory lingered, haunting the conscience of those who had deposed him. In Gloucester, his tomb became a site of quiet pilgrimage. People came to pray, to whisper of injustice, to lay offerings. Some spoke of miracles, of signs that God had marked him as a martyr. His reputation, once battered by failures and ridicule, began to soften. Where he had been mocked as weak, he was now remembered as wronged. The story of Edward II became not just the tale of a failed king, but the tragedy of a man undone by betrayal and cruelty. Meanwhile, in London, Isabella and Mortimer basked in triumph. They had overthrown a king, installed another, and ruled in his name. Yet even in their moment of power, they could not escape the shadow of the man they had cast down. For Edward III, growing into manhood, the fate of his father was a lesson engraved upon his mind. He had watched his father's humiliation, witnessed the rise of his mother and her lover, and seen how power could shift through intrigue and betrayal. These lessons would shape him, hardening his resolve to assert his own rule when the time came. The final years of Edward II thus formed the somber coda to a troubled reign. His life ended not on the battlefield, but in confinement, his crown transferred to a son, his authority consumed by those closest to him. He had been a king who loved companionship more than command, who sought affection where others demanded authority. That nature, ill-suited to the harsh necessities of kingship, had made him vulnerable. In captivity, it left him defenseless. Yet history is never content with silence. The uncertainty of his death, the rumors of survival, the tales of martyrdom, all ensured that Edward II would not simply vanish. Instead, he became part of England's political memory, a reminder of the fragility of kingship, the dangers of favorites, and the treacherous interplay between love, loyalty, and power. His son Edward III would go on to reign gloriously, reshaping England into a military power. But behind that glory stood the ghost of a father, whose fall had cleared the way, and whose suffering became the warning etched into the heart of a dynasty. Edward II's downfall did not simply end with his removal from the throne. It became a story that echoed through the centuries, a cautionary tale of how the fragile balance of kingship could shatter when personal desires collided with political necessity. His reign was marked by moments of loyalty and affection, yet those very qualities, which might have been virtues in another man, became the weaknesses that doomed his crown. The history of England remembers him not for his victories, but for his failures, and in those failures lie enduring lessons about the nature of power and the weight of monarchy. Edward's attachment to his favorites revealed the unforgiving nature of feudal politics. In Piers Gaveston, he found laughter, companionship, and unwavering loyalty. In Hugh Despenser the Younger, he found determination, cunning, and a partner willing to shoulder the burdens of command. To Edward, these bonds were deeply personal, a source of comfort in a world that often seemed hostile. But to the barons who stood outside the warmth of his circle, Gaveston and Despenser were usurpers, men who seized what belonged to the nobility by right. The more Edward clung to them, the more his lords recoiled, seeing in his devotion not affection but corruption. His companions became the targets of hatred, and when they fell, they dragged the king's authority down with them. What Edward never understood was that in the brutal world of medieval politics, sentiment was a luxury no monarch could afford. A king could favor, but he could not allow personal loyalty to overshadow the broader consensus of his realm. This truth became most clear when Edward was forced to abdicate. Few English kings had ever been deposed, and fewer still survived the act. His removal placed him in the company of monarchs who would follow in later centuries. Richard II, compelled to surrender his crown in 1399 to Henry IV, and James II, driven from power in 1688 when Parliament invited William of Orange to rule. Each of these kings shared something in common: their inability to reconcile their personal vision of rule with the expectations of their subjects. Edward II's deposition was the first such act in English history to set a clear precedent that kingship, once thought sacred and inviolable, could in fact be taken away. The crown was not indestructible. It was a trust, and when broken, it could be stripped from the brow it adorned. Edward's image in history is therefore that of the failed king. Richard II may be remembered for his poetry and grandeur, James II for his stubborn faith, and the revolution it provoked, but Edward II is remembered for weakness. Chroniclers mocked his interests in music, games, and companionship, contrasting them with the iron will of his father, Edward I. To them, he was a man unsuited for kingship, a ruler who could not command either fear or respect. Yet with time, that harsh judgment softened. The tales of his captivity, his suffering, and the mysterious circumstances of his death gave him the aura of a tragic figure, undone not solely by his own flaws, but also by betrayal and the ruthless ambition of others. In death, he gained a measure of sympathy that life had denied him. His legacy, however, extends beyond pity. The deposition of Edward II marked a shift in the very nature of English government. His reign exposed the vulnerability of kingship when it relied too heavily on personal relationships, and his fall revealed the growing importance of institutions and collective authority. The barons, the clergy, and eventually Parliament recognized that they could act not only against corrupt advisors, but against the monarch himself when he failed in his duties. The precedent established in 1327 that a king could be forced to relinquish power reshaped the idea of monarchy. It laid the foundation for a future in which kings would no longer reign unchecked, but would share power, first with the nobility and later with Parliament. For posterity, Edward's reign became a mirror held up to the dangers of neglecting the responsibilities of rule. His devotion to his favorites blinded him to the wider needs of the kingdom. His refusal to heed advice alienated those whose support was essential. His inability to assert authority in war left England humiliated on the fields of Scotland. Each failure compounded the next until his crown slipped beyond recovery. Yet the story does not end with condemnation alone. It also carries a message about the human side of kingship. Edward was a man who longed for closeness, who cherished friendship and affection, and who perhaps yearned for a life of music and leisure rather than the relentless demands of governance. His tragedy lay in the fact that a man's private desires could not coexist with the public role of a medieval king. The two were in conflict, and in that conflict the man was destroyed while the office endured. When later generations looked back, they saw Edward II not as a hero, but as a warning. They saw in him the dangers of weakness, the perils of misplaced trust, and the inevitability with which power consumes those who fail to wield it wisely. Yet in that same reflection, they also saw the transformation of monarchy itself. His fall was not only the collapse of a man, but the birth of a new political reality, one in which kingship was bound not by divine right alone, but by the expectations of nobles, clergy, and eventually the common people. Thus, the story of Edward II closes not with the triumph of his reign, but with the lessons his downfall bequeathed. He stands in history as a figure of sorrow, remembered for what he could not be, yet significant for what his fate revealed about the kingdom he ruled. His life reminds us that crowns are not made secure by sentiment, that power is not preserved by affection, and that even an anointed monarch remains vulnerable to the tides of discontent. In the silence of his captivity and the shadows of his death, Edward II left behind a legacy more enduring than any victory could have offered. The truth that kingship without wisdom, without balance, and without the trust of the realm is a fragile thing destined to fall.